Hello, and welcome to this latest edition of Talk About London, a podcast about how to make the capital city a better place. I'm Leanne Tritton, Chair of the London Society, one of the UK's oldest charitable civic societies.
And I'm Dave Hill, publisher and editor of the journalism website onlondon.co.uk.
So often when we talk about the built environment, it is the big stuff that captures the headlines: infrastructure, museums, architecturally significant buildings. However, much of the joy or the distress in our daily lives lies much closer to home and at the very basic level, the actual streets beneath our feet. Well-maintained, clean streets that are cared for give us a sense of joy and well-being, while rubbish, litter, weeds can immediately make us sense decay. So our episode today is to explore the importance of the street and how we can do better.
We are joined by Nicholas Boys-Smith. He is the founder and chairman of Create Streets, a former government advisor on urban design and housing, and a leading advocate for building beautiful human-scale places. Nicholas, welcome.
Thank you very much. All those B's, they're very hard to say, aren't they, altogether? Thank you for calling me a leading advocate. That sounds very flattering. I'm very grateful. I hope it's true.
Okay, well, we'll find out in the next 30 minutes. Nicholas, you've been campaigning for many years to make our streets more beautiful. So why exactly does that matter?
Well, it's not just beauty, though that is definitely part of it. What places look like, what anything look like, matters to us. We take, slightly depending on which academic you listen to, somewhere between 94 and 97% of our information we take in visually. So sort of what a thing looks like, be it a street or a teapot, matters to our response to it. So why do streets matter? Why does the design of why do the design of our streets matter? The management of them? I mean, it's multi-layered. It has a direct consequence on our physical and our mental health. So if any street, perhaps particularly ones close to our home, if they feel safe and pleasant, agreeable to walk in or to cycle in, we are, guess what, more likely to walk or cycle in them. And we know that the more we walk or cycle, on the whole, other things held equal in controlled studies across the world, we are more likely to be healthy. We know, for example, that if the front side of our house is pleasant and well maintained, we're more likely to speak to our neighbours. Speaking to our neighbours is basically good for us and good for communal links, as long as we're not forced to talk to them when we don't want to. So it matters at that basic level, basically any street anywhere, in any country, in any town in the world. Then when it comes, which I think is probably what we'll talk about a bit more today, when it comes to high streets, to main streets, as our American cousins call them, to the town centre. And by that in a way, I don't necessarily just mean that one street. I might mean the network, the fibrous grid of streets around, the middle, the village green, the town square, whatever it might be. Then it takes, I think, another couple of layers of importance over and above that quotidian consequence for our personal health and well-being and sense of neighbourliness. For many of us, not all of us, that town centre, that high street, actually visually, almost conceptually, defines our sense of our home, of our neighbourhood, of our place. So it has I'll say the word, it has a symbolic, a metaphorical importance for our sense of ourselves and our location in the world. And then depending on how it's managed or not, and come back to that, that will also then have a direct consequence for our propensity to go there, to shop, to meet people, to spend time. And as high streets evolve, again, something we'll probably come back to, from being less purely retail to being more of a place where lots of things happen and we're pulled together coterminously, living, shopping, eating, having a coffee, meeting people. Clearly, if the high street is smelly or unpleasant or badly managed or has fox poo in it or whatever it might be, you're less likely to do those things. Now, if you're going to buy a pint of milk because you need a pint of milk urgently, that's not going to have much consequence on your behaviour. If you're going to and this is a classic use of a functioning town centre, you've dropped little Johnny or Jane or whoever at school. The town centre high street is round the corner. You then go there to do a bit of shopping you could probably do elsewhere, but it's nice to do it there. And then you arrange to meet, blog-ins for a quick coffee before you go and do something else. That's how a town centre or a high street works, by pulling different things together. And then you get some serendipity. You're doing this and this happens. And so to finally answer your question, Dave, so I can get there in the end, that is why the management and the look and the visualisation and the safety of our streets matters at multiple levels, from personal health to labeliness to sense of home to sense of purpose, and then also to how a town actually works and pulls us together.
So you're talking particularly with regard to high streets. You're talking about them really as social spaces, aren't you? They're like almost like extensions of your front room. Almost, it's you step outside your house and you're into this immediate, proximate social space where all kinds of things go on, and you want it to be a nice place to be.
Yes, I mean, most of us don't live immediately outside a high street, but certainly if we go there, then it's performing that function. But it's a function as well as a social function. So, you are likely, not always, to do a thing there. It might be your shopping, it might be your meeting someone, it might be your arranging for something to take place. But yes, it's a combination of a nice place to spend time, a place to meet people, a place to do things, possibly, in fact, increasingly, you can see this already in the stats, a place to work. So particularly outside the city centres, in the Zoom economy, here's an example of the Zoom economy we're all taking part in right now, as fewer people go into city centres to work 5 days a week, and having those little local hubs, and the obvious place to put them, is on a high street. So yes, it works to multiple levels.
Yeah, okay. Now, do you sense, and I know that quite a lot of people I speak to sense that we're talking about London in this podcast, but not just in London. In fact, perhaps in some ways worse in other parts of the country. But let's focus on London. Has there been, in your view, a sort of deterioration of, to use a generic, the high street in London in recent years? And if so, why is that?
Yes, I mean, just to sort of preface my answer, I think bluntly, we in London, I'm a Londoner, probably are better off than much of the country. And I think it's important to reflect that before we dive in, because there may be people watching this saying, well, wish we had your problems. So I think, London is on the whole more prosperous.
And it's a very, very big place and extremely varied, of course,
So all caveats aside. I mean, Tony Travers has talked about a gratification of the public realm of London, and I'm afraid I think he's broadly right. Why has that happened? I mean, I think, again, there's rarely one cause for any, for a problem, but so what are some of them? Well, I think at a deep level, and we were talking about this briefly before we started the recording, talking about place and location has been slightly devalued over the last 50 or 60 years. I've certainly had, I suspect both of you had, conversations where, you start talking about this and someone, often, but not always a politician or a senior official, says, oh, the hanging baskets. Yeah, you think that, putting up some hanging baskets will solve everything. Of course, we're not saying that. But so I think there is a bit of a cultural, this stuff doesn't matter. That's something that the French do, or, something that the Dutch would do. And we're more functional than that. We don't waste our time and our money on this stuff. So I think there's a bit of that. Clearly, probably beyond our scope today, there has been pressure on local government resources and cash flows over the last 10 or 15 years. I think that's almost too obvious to go into. But then I think over and above that, and this is probably where it's more useful to focus, there are two things that have happened more in the last 10 years. The first, obviously, is that with the Zoom economy, and with the liberalisation over a generation now of out-of-town shopping, there has been pressure on the high street as a place that people use for their daily or their weekly shop. So that has taken out some of the footfall. That's clearly true. But then also, I think there are literally technical and operational mistakes in how we choose to manage our public realm. Now, we've looked at 3 or 4 of those at Create Streets. I mean, frankly, there are others, and I wouldn't claim deep expertise in all of them. But if you like, I can just unpick a couple of those. So look, 3 things we have noticed and have tried to draw public attention to. The first is what we've termed street scars, which is that under the New Roads Act of 1991, I think from memory, if a utilities firm rips up the York Podestone pavings or the sets or the cobbles on a street, or any street, they've got 6 months to put it back like for like, and then they're only fined £2,500 if they don't. And that's not working. We can come back to that in more detail. Second thing that we've realised is not working is that all of our public realm, but particularly high streets, are awash with phone boxes that are just not used anymore, and that very often are then receptacles for litter, for urine, for criminal behaviour, and just general gratification. And it is actually possible for local councils to get them removed, but it's certainly difficult and more expensive and complex than it should. And then thirdly, our management of commercial waste is frankly rubbish, if you'll forgive a very obvious pun. And the consequence of that is based on a little bit of polling we did, an approximate halving of the attraction of the public realm, with I think an all but definite, I don't think we've completely proven it, but it fits common sense, a consequential lower propensity of people to go and spend time in the high street. So there are three things, and there are obviously others. I'll press pause on myself there so Leanne can interrogate and investigate as you wish.
Yeah, right on cue. Leanne.
I agree with everything you've said, by the way. The only thing I would question, and as you were talking, I was questioning myself, because I do wander around saying it's getting worse. But actually, I arrived in London in 1995, and I can remember being shocked at the state of the streets. So I was living in Shepherd's Bush, and I came from Australia. And in Australia, I've always sort of joked that culturally, if you drop litter or you debase the streets, if you're an axe murderer, you get less grief. It's just culturally not the thing to do to have rubbish everywhere. And I can remember living in Shepherd's Bush, and always feeling it was grim, Shepherd's Bush Green and around there. And there was always rubbish. And again, I can remember seeing a vox pop on the BBC where, BBC London, and again, this is 30 years ago, was asking people what they thought about litter. And I was absolutely stunned when there were more than one person who said, it's not my job. I drop litter because other people pick it up. So my only question on that is, have we got worse, or has London always had a bit of a cultural problem with being a bit grotty?
Well, so, it's quite a hard thing to research this, isn't it? Two thoughts. So certainly there have been perceptions that London is grotty, for literally, I think, for as long as we've got evidence about London. And there was a lot of complaints about the squalor in London in the 19th century. And foreign ambassadors often commented on it. And of course, in the 19th century, we lived in the Carboniferous age, burning coal. So London was sort of just drenched in soot and grime in a way that actually, for all the problems of car fumes, none of us can really, almost imagine. We were all old enough, I think, to remember it, but none of us can properly imagine it anymore. Certainly my children can't. And I'm old enough to remember the Victorian soot and smog and smoke essentially being cleaned off buildings like the House of Parliament, which were black 50 years ago. So no, at one level, we're way cleaner with a much more healthy London than we were 100 years ago, since the Clean Air Act in the 1950s. So, there's some good news. And there clearly were levels, and there's photographic evidence of this, there clearly were levels of squalor in some bits of London and indeed other British cities that now would seem inconceivable because, bluntly, local government wasn't good into the parish system into the late 19th century, and rubbish wasn't picked up very well. And it sort of depended where you were, and if the nice posh bits, the West End, they had private people to help, and it was all fine. So are things in many ways better than 100 years ago? Yes, they are. What I think has happened over the last 50 or 60 years, just to sort of pull it back into sort of, living memory, is that London did get quite a lot better from the 1980s through to I'm not quite sure when, and did get cleaner and did get better managed. And if you like, the wealth from the long boom from the 1980s through to the Blair era, some of it percolated through into local government management. We've not grown at the same rate over the last 15 years, and there's been austerity. Let's not get into the politics of that. And that has put pressure. So I think it has got worse than it was 10, 20 years ago. I don't think it's worse than it was 50 years ago, and it's certainly much better than it was 100 years ago. So my glass, if not completely half full, is certainly not completely empty. And
I don't want you to, thank you for that, and I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I'm not saying because it was grim in the past we should accept it now. It's just it has been a particular, there's a cultural mix in that.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Really interesting.
I think that's very fair.
Can I come in again with a question specifically about the report that Create Streets put out quite recently, which was about this question of collecting commercial waste and so on. I think it would be very useful for our audience if you were able to just very simply sum up the findings of that, because there's quite a lot of complicated stuff in there, and there are many dimensions to this problem. But are you able to sort of distill this into a nice agenda for improvement, Nicholas?
I'll do my very best. You're right that it is complicated. The good news is I didn't actually write the report. I just sort of wrote the summary. So hopefully that will help me not get too dragged into all of the detail. So in a nutshell, we have deregulated the management of commercial waste. So residential waste, as everyone will know, essentially once a week you put your bins out, and they get collected, and there's a process. So yes, they've got bins out there for a morning or a day a week, and it's not great, but that's fine. With commercial waste, that's not the case. There's a multiplicity of providers. On the whole, different shops or commercial operators in high streets have different needs or different timeframes. If you're a restaurant, you're clearly going to create more rubbish, more noxiously, more frequently, than a shoe shop. And so it's not unreasonable for a shoe shop to want to spend less on its commercial waste management than a restaurant. That's an inherent challenge. And once you've got a traditional high street and lots of shops proximate, then clearly you've got a potential for a lot of rubbish in a short period of time. Because it's been deregulated, that can actually, deregulation is not inherently, I think, a bad thing in this world. So if you've got a retail box land out in the sticks, you can probably cope with different lorries and vans coming several times a week or even several times a day. In a high street, because we don't have, and comes back to Leanne's very sensible cultural point, we don't have this perhaps a stronger tradition of bins and management as in some countries. Most days of the week in many high streets, you not only can, you will see piles of rubbish, on the whole in plastic bags, piled high. Often it is thought to be fly tipping. Indeed, there are many, many reports of fly tipping that aren't in fact fly tipping. So to finally try and answer your question, we need to control a bit better how we manage commercial waste, accepting that it will be put out more than once a week in some cases, but that then goes, it isn't just dumped in bags. And so that when you walk down a high street, there is not quite a high likelihood that you will just see rubbish, for several hours of each day.
All right. So if deregulation is the problem or part of the problem, how do you re-regulate in an effective way?
So I think it's, because I don't want to put this in deliberately don't want to put it in political terms, because I think this is something that actually everyone or nearly everyone can agree on. Some things should be deregulated, and some things just don't work as a total free market. So I think there's we always try when we sort of write reports to say, well, who can do what when? So there are things that shops on their own can do today that make things better. So you can create a refuse buyers clubs, a group of shops, perhaps working with a bid. You can consolidate points. You can essentially, as a collectivity, you can manage this better. The classic example of this, which we cite at length actually in the report, is Bond Street. Bond Street, as anyone in London will know, Bond Street is not an average high street. It's selling jewels to people at higher price points than I can personally afford. Hang on, I'm going to get my numbers here. Yes, I remember. The number of vehicle collections on Bond Street has gone down by 94% over the last few years.
And so that's just because they've got themselves better organised.
They've just organised it. Now, obviously, they're richer shops. It's probably a bit easier for them to do it than your average high street. Let's not pretend otherwise. But that's so a high street on its own, above all working with a business improvement district, can do this. So that's level one. Level two is that councils actually have more powers than many of them make use of. So there are things that any council official or councillor watching this or listening to this could start doing the day after tomorrow. So on the whole, you can make use of something called Section 47 of the Environment Act, 1990. You can put up fines, and there are ways in which you can redraft your local rules to reduce the burden of proof on councils that people are fly tipping or not operating performance. So there are a set of things that councils can do. But then probably to go the whole hog and make it easier for all high streets to manage this better, I think we probably will need to move to a phase, some of which can be done by local councils, some of which might need a little bit of a state change, to reduce the number of operators through stronger licensing in town centres. I don't think you necessarily need to reduce them, as I say, in an out-of-town shopping zone. I think there's that specific high street when you've got that density of shops and other operations all together. And the more, perversely, the better the high street is functioning, the more that's going on, the more restaurants, the more people.
You've explained sort of what's going wrong very well. And what has always confused me, so near where I live, you were talking about restaurants. There are a couple of restaurants in our high street, and I'm in Camden, and they leave their rubbish in bags overnight. Now, that is because the provider, that's how they do it. That's how they pick it up. And guess what happens every single night? The foxes come.
I thought foxes might be coming into the centre.
Exactly. So every morning, all the school children, and I watch them, they all walk over, chicken carcasses and banana skins and everything else. And it's really hideous.
It's revolting.
So we've got this, if I was working in local government, I'd be looking at this every day and thinking, why has this not moved to the top of the agenda? Because it's not that, it must be solvable because other countries do solve it. So why can't we solve it?
I mean, I can't speak for Camden specifically, and I won't speak for us. So we can solve it. There are high streets where this, I just mentioned one, Bond Street, there are others, where this is being solved. And it can be solved at 3 levels, but, let's most people are not bad people. We all have a tendency to be lazy, but let's put ourselves in the positions of, I'll make it hypothetical restaurants. You've got underpaid people working until 2 a.m. They're cleaning it all out, after we've all gone to bed. The rubbish collecting is coming first thing in the morning. They don't want to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning to put it out. I assume that's humanly what is happening in terms of the actual management of people's lives on a daily basis. Is it possible, either for all the resident shops or for you as neighbours, to decide, right, we are going to collectively not do this to ourselves because it's making our high street less successful. It's pushing down rents, probably. It's probably making fewer people want to be there. They may not care about what happens at 8 o'clock in the morning because the restaurants aren't doing any business then. So it is something the restaurants and shops could do collectively. Then there is options. I mean, there's probably not. Let's not get into sort of too much nitty gritty on the operational detail on the call, but there are options for the council to push up fines and to put them, to shame, to publicly shame. There are options to some limited degree to reduce the number of operators and to put pressure and to make it tougher to license so that you're enforcing, picking up at certain times. Ultimately, there will be capacity for shops or restaurants to avoid that, possibly without some degree of legislative change. But if they wish to, a high street can get better, but you may need a little bit of push rather than relying on, people for whom it's important to have some sympathy. The people finishing cleaning out the restaurant at 2 o'clock in the morning, probably underpaid and probably with a long journey back home or something, pretty rubbish.
Yeah. So let me bring up a couple of other sort of issues that I feel are related to this, and then put you another broader question. So perhaps you can answer it all in one go. So
I'll try.
As somebody who walks around a lot.
Yeah.
So the couple of things that worry me. One is, are we doing a good enough job with helping the street homeless and people who you encounter begging on the streets? Is the charity sector and local authorities, are they overloaded? Are they finding it difficult to help those people in the way that we would like to? Because I think they're part of the sort of social landscape or environmental landscape that we're talking about. And also the problem of what I call nuisance cycling. And you said at the beginning that, cycling is a good thing. And I agree that it's a good thing for transport policy to encourage, particularly as in preference to private motor vehicles. But we do get quite a lot of sort of unruly cyclists on pavements. And I think this sort of e-bike phenomenon has added to that. So the point I'm making is that there's a whole bundle of things that all go together into this. Really slightly puzzles me is that there isn't more of a sort of big political push from whichever party to talk about these issues, because as Leanne said in her introduction, our sense of how things are going, our sense of how we feel about our neighbourhood, how things are going in the neighbourhood, in our town, in our city, in the country, is sort of tied up with how we feel about high streets and that whole environment. So surely there should be somebody should be saying, we can look at all of these issues in the round, we can bring together all the responsible and interested parties and make it a big crusade. It seems to me that for any political party to really sort of pick that one up as a big campaigning issue and show that they can make a difference would be marvellous to see good results, and it would bring political dividends too. What do you think about that?
So let me take your 2 specific points and then come back to your broader point. And I'll start with my least good answer, and hopefully my subsequent ones will be a little bit more insightful. So on rough sleepers, I mean, We Create Streets haven't done research on that, so I wouldn't claim to know more about that than the average listener or watcher to this. Other than to say, the problem will always be there and is always manageable up to a point. I don't mean that. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but in the sense that a big city will always create people who are struggling. and they always need management, and it's always complex.
I completely accept that. Yeah.
But I probably I don't think I'd want to comment in detail on rough sleeping policy, because I just don't think I know enough about it to do so insightfully. If that's okay. It's not trying to be as I'm not a politician, and I'm not responsible for the management. But hopefully you'll let me get away with that. On the cycling one, where I think I do know a bit. Yeah, I recognise exactly what you said. Actually, there was an interesting article in a magazine I read the other day, exactly that, on what you might call cycling culture in London, and how it's quite a bit of a Wild West out there. I certainly, I empathise very strongly. We have e-bikes, often parked, blocking the pavement, literally just outside my house. My mother, who's just turned 80, is losing her sight. My parents don't live in London, but come quite frequently. My mother actually now struggles to walk around London pavements because she finds bicycles keep being in her way. And, I'll try and be a dutiful son, so that bothers me. And I think it's legitimate to be bothered by that. So, we are moving, and we should move, to a London where we use cycles more and cars less, because cars are just not very efficient ways of getting around in an urban place. You clearly can have a culture of well-behaved cyclists, obeying the lights and not going on the pavements, but you do need a bit of shame and a bit of punishment and a bit of duty, and we're not quite getting it right at the moment. And I say that, we're all different things at different times of the day. I'm a cyclist, I'm a pedestrian, I'm a driver, depending on where and what. We're not quite getting it right. See, if a cyclist was watching this, and doubtless some will, they'd say, but cars are much worse and they can kill you more than a cycle can. In a way, they're right. Well, they are right. But yes, so there is something to do there with culture, I think, actually more than legality, because driving an e-bike fast along the pavement is already not allowed, but people still do it. So there's something there, and obviously we get into the Uber world and the delivery on that. On the wider point, obviously I agree with that, because I set up Create Streets to care about this sort of things. I guess I'd say, two things. I mean, it's quite notable that, as I understand it, and this is in public domain, one of the reasons that the previous government got into levelling up, this is going beyond London now as a conversation, was because, multiple focus groups as well as polling said what you just said, which is that people really do care about this. And I've been in conversations, mainly outside London, but also in London, where people's sense of the degradation, I deliberately use that word, the degradation of their home, of their place, of their part of the world, is something that really grates them. Sometimes their behaviour doesn't quite mesh with that. So actually, when you ask them where they go shopping, they go to the out-of-town shopping centre or whatever it might be. But their sense of the horror of it and of the degradation is real and is quite profoundly felt, even if it doesn't always flow through logically to their actions. So clearly, a very major part of the last government's policy agenda was, I think, a consequence of that. As I understand it, and I've not seen the data on this, I've seen reports in the media, but as I understand it, both people voting for, and let's not get into a Brexit or a reform or a wider comment, but, quite a lot of the people who voted for Brexit, quite a lot of the people who are or are tempted to vote for reform, actually complain about the physical state of their local place. I'm not making comments on immigration or elsewhere. Let's go into that. But
no, I've seen
that must be one of the factors.
I think I've seen exactly the same thing, or I've certainly seen work pointing to exactly the same thing. But it just reinforces our point, I think that a sense of decline is something that sort of gets into your soul because it's there almost on your doorstep.
And I think the reason it's because I think it has been unvalidated as a thing to care about, and yet we do care about it. I mean, I think we can show from the data that we care about it. In a way, that's why it bubbles up more. In the sense, so it was very interesting when I was co-chairing this commission for the last government, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, all those B's again. We got a lot of both spontaneous interaction with the public and then people responding to our call for evidence. I'm obviously going to massively simplify now, but one of the key themes we got was thank you for caring about this. Thank you for talking about it. Thank you for using, the beauty word, which is a bit invalidated in policy circles, but it's completely normal in everyday life. I feel validated. That's my word, not theirs. I now feel I can talk about this. To some degree, and we Create Streets find this both when we're talking about management and stewardship of existing places or how we design new ones. When you come along, I've got my double-barreled name and I live in London and I've got a RP accent and all this. When I come along and talk about some of this stuff and show that I certainly think it cares and that we think it cares and that we've got research that shows this stuff matters to our behaviour and to our sense of purpose, then it's almost as if we sort of let out a cork. When you're running a group you're running something in Grimsby or you're in Sunderland or you're in Hertfordshire, and people just feel empowered to talk about it and admit that they care and that this matters. So I think it does. And I think sensible politicians, respond to that. And
okay,
when I set up Create Streets a decade ago, it was well, actually, weirdly, it was in the room I'm speaking to you from. It was me in this room on my own, and we have done a little bit in the last few years, and that must be to some degree because we're pushing at something that is real, I think.
Okay, thanks very much, Leanne.
Yes, I was just going to add that when Dave and I discussed this issue as an issue for the podcast, one of the things that we were concerned about is that people might think it's an old issue. As you get older, you worry about all of these things. Suddenly you mutter a lot more than you do when you're younger. But in fact, I think we have concurred that most young people are very concerned about this. And it's interesting when you look at Instagram and social media and the young ones who go out and they go to the beautiful parts of London to take photos. Even graffiti art is beauty, and but they go to places where they want to look good. And they appreciate. And I think we underestimate that young people do want to be in nice places. And Dave and I have children sort of not together, but of similar ages. And they all complain about, or not so much complain, but have noted that the quality of the streetscape does affect them, and they don't want it. So I think the mainstream media are missing a trick, and if you could talk a little bit about your social media journey, but I think the mainstream media are really missing a trick on some of these issues. And I know at the London Society, we've also found this with toilets, for example. So things like rubbish, toilets, street scars, bins, those sorts of things are seen as just so low down on the priority list. But in fact, they're very high up, and someone needs to be clever and get hold of it.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. A couple of thoughts. Just on the youth versus old dynamic, and then I'll come back to social media. We've done quite a lot of polling on this, and we've looked at behavioural data. Yeah, you're right. So people's sense of aesthetics and where they want to be doesn't actually vary much with age or social demographic, or whether you're left wing or right wing or old or young or rich or poor. I mean, there are slight slopes in the data. It's actually quite a nice fact, I think, which is this is something we agree on. So we can see we do lots of visual preference surveys. It doesn't really matter whether you're a Tory, Lib Dem, Reform or Labour, or old or young, how you respond to it. I mean, it's certainly not in any predictable way. So this is something we agree about, what it means to be a nice place in which we wish to spend time. It's a very predictable phenomenon. It's not age-related in any meaningful way. There is a slight phenomenon, certainly when you're talking about changes to a place, that it's harder to get young people to engage in the process, particularly, for various reasons. Typically, they think it's, and they're often correct, that they are less likely to be living there in 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years' time. So why bother? Whereas clearly, if you have lived somewhere for a while and think you're going to live there for a longer time, there's more incentive to engage. And also, the longer we've lived in a neighbourhood, the more emotional we are about it, because we've got more of our own personal familial memories that, associate with that place. So, destroy the bench in which I proposed to my wife, whatever it might be. Clearly, you're going to have an emotional response to that, even if the bench is pretty grotty and concrete. So there is nevertheless a slightly harder to get younger people to engage in that type of conversation because of where they are in their life cycle. To come back to the social media and the media point, I mean, again, short answer, yes. We talked about this, I think, a little bit before we started recording. So when we did our first of our papers on the management of the public realm and the management of high streets, the one I referred to earlier called Street Scars, looking at the rules on ripping up pavings, we couldn't get media interest. So we just chucked it out there into our Twitter feed and various others. And it really got picked up, actually. So I mean, we realised we'd obviously pressed a button, because it did go sort of semi-viral quite quickly. And then the media, of course, come back to us. So then we got onto the World Tonight, I think, on BBC4, and I think The Guardian covered it. And actually, to be fair to them, the BBC have consistently covered it since. So I've done at least 2 TV interviews with BBC bits and bobs on over the summer on this. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's their major campaign, but it's tickling along, and it got into bits of the media, perhaps to your point actually, that We Create Street don't normally get into. So I'm going to admit now I can't now remember the name of the programme, but whatever the main BBC sort of magazine programme is on a weekday morning, which I must confess I don't normally watch, but we had a 10-minute slot on it, which is not actually that trivial. So I think they can be made to pick up on it. Interestingly, the commercial rubbish has by miles been the hardest sell, and I suspect it's the same with lavatories. It just doesn't just doesn't something they don't want to put it on the front page. They just don't think it's sexy, to perhaps use the deliberate cliche. So yeah, I think more to do on that one. And we want to get a little bit of budget and time, because basically to properly spend time talking to ministers and officials and local council officials on this, because you just need to put the time in to explain it, to persuade them, and we haven't quite managed to get the budget to do that. But to reassure you, we do wish to, and we are trying. And indeed, if anyone watching feels like throwing money at us to do this, please, sort of ring the number on your screen now. Sort of
the man has no shame whatsoever.
Sorry, Dave.
It's too late for sorry. I'm going to hand myself back to Leanne now.
Well, first of all, Nicholas, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. And like with most of the conversations that Dave and I have been having, we only just scratched the surface. And, there are some bright spots. And I just wanted to, before we go, you were talking about social media, and there's two guys called the Maker Twins, who I'm completely obsessed by. They're young guys who run a cleaning company, and they started going around cleaning bins. They did Warren Street Tube Station, which, oh my God, that was so grim. But they go around and clean. And to your point about social media, they have hundreds of thousands of followers who love watching them clean things. And so I think
Couldn't make it up.
You couldn't make it up, but it's wonderful to see young people seeing this as an opportunity. And I think we just have to keep pushing on this. And the other thing about London, which I think a lot of people underestimate, is the power of 9 million people to live well together. And there's always been, sort of unspoken etiquette when you get on the tube and do things like those things. And to Dave's point about Lime bikes and the way we behave, I think we need a campaign, which sounds so old-fashioned, but how do you bring manners back? That you don't need regulation, you don't need a policy or a government department, but manners, how do you behave? How do you put your rubbish away? How do you look after people? How do you not park your Lime bike right in the front of an office door, which I saw the other day? Now, that's not a Lime bike problem. That's the person who rode the damn thing. So how do we all, as citizens, bring back that sort of amazing London vibe where we actually get on quite well together if we put in a little bit of effort?
Okay, Leanne, you can answer that question if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to say to that, is there, other than yes, but it does need a mixture of people to. I don't want to get to John Majory. You need to be able to say and have the confidence to say that not doing this is wrong, and that it's antisocial and it's rude. That's perhaps the right word to use, actually. It's a rude way, an uncivil, I'm deliberately using slightly old-fashioned words. It's an uncivil way to respond and to interact with your fellow men and women. And yeah, there's a role for the mayor in that. There's a role for local councils. There's a role for all of us, actually. Hopefully we're doing it a bit now. So if you're watching this and you've misparked your Lime bike, you are rude. You're being rude to your neighbours.
Maybe that's the thing. Maybe we have to make rude the new word. So instead of yelling other 4-letter words, we just call people very rude.
Yes, that sounds
a war on rude. English. You heard war it there first. Rude. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, we're going to wrap up, Nicholas, not because we've run out of things to say, but because we could go on for hours. And so on behalf of Dave and I, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure,
and explaining why it's so important to keep our streets nice.
Thank you very much for inviting me.